So I'm interested in thinking about this question today a little bit together. We're only going to be able to touch on a few minor aspects of this because we're doing a lot of history in a really short period of time. But why should Christians give money to the poor? Why should anybody? It might seem that the answer to these questions is kind of obvious and intuitive, and I would hope that everyone in this room has thought a lot about them already. But what I really want to underscore today is that the way we think about and answer these questions is not a given. It's historically contingent and it's culturally contingent. And I think we really need to understand that if we're going to understand how we can put this idea into practice. And the ways that it's been shaped by kind of historical forces are important for that as well. Most people today, I would say, probably most of you, think that, well, the obvious answer to that is that poverty is a terrible thing. No one, you might say, should have to beg or go without food or go without shelter, especially in a world where so many of us are so very rich. Now, I'm a good modern person myself. I'm a sort of paid up modern post-Enlightenment liberal. I think I'm totally on board with that. But why is that the case? Is that obvious? I don't think it is an obvious Christian or human view. And we need to be attentive to the way that view has come about if we're effectively to put it into practice. You might say, well, of course Christians should seek to eradicate poverty. Jesus is always going on in the Gospels about this kind of thing. And almsgiving has been a central Christian practice from the very earliest days of the church. Look at the book of Acts, right? Almsgiving really, really central there. Well, yes and no, right? Let's look at the text that's always been, throughout Christian history, the most cited passage on this subject from Matthew 19. Since I'm an early modernist, I work on the 16th and 17th century, I'll give it to you in the King James Version, but I'm sure everyone knows it. So if you read Matthew 19, beginning at the 16th verse, "And behold, one came and said unto him, Good master, what good thing shall I do, that I may have eternal life? And he said unto him, Why callest thou me good? There is none good but one, that is God. But if thou wilt enter into life, keep the commandments. He saith unto him, Which? Jesus said, Thou shalt do no murder. I'm pretty good on that one so far. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Honor thy father and mother. And thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And the young man saith unto him, All these things have I kept from my youth up. What lack I yet? Jesus said unto him, If thou wilt be perfect, go and sell that thou hast, and give to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven, and come and follow me. But when the young man heard that saying, he went away sorrowful, for he had many possessions. Then Jesus said unto his disciples, Verily I say unto you that a rich man shall hardly enter into the kingdom of heaven. And again I say unto you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of God. And what I want to draw your attention to in this passage is the nature of Jesus' claim. He doesn't root his instruction in the suffering of the poor. He doesn't say in that passage, how can you keep all of these great possessions, rich young man? When, behold, there are so many on your very doorstep who lack even the little they need to survive. How can you allow such poverty? He doesn't say that, right? That isn't the focus of the passage. Instead, the focus is squarely and absolutely on the rich young man, the state of his soul and his salvation. The question isn't, how can there be people who are so poor? The question is, how can there be people who are so rich? Almsgiving as a concept in the early and medieval church focused overwhelmingly not on the alleviation of the suffering of the poor, but on the salvation of the rich. The poor, Jesus says, you will have with you always. The poor, especially vagrant beggars, were seen in the early and medieval church to have an essential role in society as missionaries to their more prosperous neighbors. The Lord hears the cry of the poor, it was thought, and so their prayers, the prayers of the poor, are especially efficacious. The rich provide material goods for the physical sustenance of the poor, ideally, while the poor provide spiritual goods for the salvation of the rich. You will have treasure in heaven, offering them opportunities to exercise charity and interceding on their behalf with God. Though the poor suffered in this life, they would assuredly enjoy the paradise of heaven for eternity. The rich, by contrast, weighed down by this worldly possessions, were ever at risk of the ultimate fall into the abyss of hell itself. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. And in the Middle Ages, many Christians took this idea to its logical conclusion. Christians should own nothing at all. Poverty is a desirable state. The ascetic Eremitic movement, which began with figures like St. Anthony of Egypt, sojourning into the desert to pray and fight with demons, evolved into religious communities of ascetics known as monks and nuns. And these people, at least when living up to the ideals of their orders, actively embraced poverty as a positive good and denounced private property as an evil. The enormously influential rule of Benedict of Nursia declares, quote, "The vice of private ownership must be uprooted from the monastery. No one without the abbot's permission shall dare to give, receive, or keep anything, not a book, tablet, or pen, nothing at all." And we dare to have kind of electronic tablets and computers and all these sorts of things. They're not even allowed to have a wax tablet and stylus. It's a different conception of what kind of relationship you ought to have to material possessions as a Christian. And the logic here, the focus is not, don't have a wax stylus so that you can give the money you would have spent on it to the poor. It's that having it in itself is a problem. Certainly, monastic orders cared for the poor. By the High Middle Ages, it was typical for a large monastic house to distribute not only a daily dole of bread, pottage, or cash to the poor of the community, and there are really interesting medieval discussions of whether or not it's better to give the poor bread or cash that kind of interestingly parallel some contemporary discussions around, should you give direct aid or aid in kind. So they did this every day. They also distributed more major alms on important feast days and on the obits of major donors, the anniversaries of the day of their death. So they're giving out a huge amount of charity. They're also providing education, routine medical care, what we might now call hospice care for the elderly and the dying. By the time of the Reformation here in England alone, there were well over 500 hospitals. That term has come to mean a facility for medical care. At that time, it meant much more care for someone who was otherwise destitute. Maybe someone who's very elderly, someone who just doesn't have any money, someone who's ill, and by caring for the ill, it sort of comes to have a more medical term today. But this was not, we need to see, the primary purpose of monasteries. Their aim was to provide an opportunity for the monks and the nuns themselves to attain salvation, and a space in which these holy women and men could pray for those outside the monastery, taking advantage of the status they acquired as poor individuals to intercede with Christ on behalf of those outside. To be truly close to Christ, the monk had to become poor. The 13th century saw an even more radical interpretation of this idea in response to the alleged slackness of some of the monasteries. They were getting a bit lazy with their poverty, which led to an explosion of the so-called mendicant or begging orders, with the Carmelites founded near the end of the 12th century, the Franciscans founded in 1209, the Dominicans in 1216, and the Augustinians in 1244. Don't worry if you don't know what any of these are. The point is, these are orders that travel around from place, but they're not in a monastery. They're going from place to place every day, begging for their daily bread in a very literal sense, right? They beg people for bread, and if they don't get any, they don't eat. So they're even more sort of aggressive in some ways, even more stringent version of this ideal. In this vision, you don't just have to be poor, you have to be an itinerant beggar to model Christ. Or certainly that's an ideal way to do it. Again, not primarily so that the poor can receive money, but so that those entering these orders can cleanse their own souls from the dead weight of worldly possessions and store up treasure in heaven. Some followers of St. Francis of Assisi, the founder of this Franciscan order, the Fraticelli or Zelanti, insisted that Jesus himself owned nothing, not even the clothes on his back, and that Christians should likewise live in absolute poverty. This wasn't framed chiefly as a material state. As Lee Palmer Wandel, in a very influential essay on the subject, has argued, quote, "Francis sought to imitate not the outward gestures of Christ, but a complex psychology of faith, in which the protections of property had to be stripped away in order to place the Christian in absolute and radical dependence upon God." Poverty for Francis was not a simple material state. Physical poverty was the visualization, the theatrical expression of man's spiritual state before God. That physical condition helped human beings to life in humility, without the trappings of status or of patrimony, more completely in the consciousness of their poverty of spirit and in the psychological and social stance of the servant. More than any other order, she writes, the Franciscans gave visible form to a particular conception of humanity before God. Man is a beggar before God. Begging is therefore framed as something holy and necessary, the physical reminder of a spiritual reality. And hagiographic medieval lives of the saints, these accounts of the lives of holy people, abound in radical descriptions of the physical poverty of their subjects. One of the most influential medieval reformers was Bernard of Clairvaux. And one of the classic descriptions of him says, quote, "He was a man horrible with filthiness, whose shriveled flesh stuck everywhere to his bones, whose body never tasted too much wine, nor his mouth any delicacies, save for spiritual ones." It's a different ideal at play here, right? Imagine if I told you, you should really come to my church, it's really great. What's really great about the pastor? Oh, he's a man horrible with filthiness, whose shriveled flesh sticks everywhere to his bone. Right? You would say, that's a little bit of a weird pitch for your church. This is maybe a strange place that I don't necessarily want to go. But in the Middle Ages, that was seen as the ideal of the holy man, right? A starving, filthy person who has no concern whatsoever for the things of this world and has been freed from any desire, not only for material wealth, right? This is going beyond renouncing wealth. No desire even for the most basic elements of material life. The question was not how can there be people who are so poor. Poverty was seen as holy, was seen as a uniquely privileged route to access God. Some problems with that conception we'll come back to a little later, but it's an interesting contrast with the way we tend to think about it now. As Carter Lindbergh has put it, quote, "Medieval church tradition idealized poverty as the subject for good works by the rich and powerful, and as the condition which best allowed a person to lead an evangelic life." The best condition in which to lead a Christian life is one of poverty. Poverty, begging, and almsgiving therefore interacted with the medieval system of penitence and salvation in at least two ways. Firstly, poverty was understood to confer a form of righteousness before God, as it both signaled and substantively created an absolute dependence on God. You can't think that you're going to be all right without God if you're literally relying on God for your daily food. Secondly, the poor offered the rich both a model of Christian life, reminding them that their wealth was but transient, and an opportunity to perform the good works necessary, though not sufficient, in the medieval scheme for salvation by giving alms. So that's the medieval vision. Then the Reformation comes in. I'm not going to do a whole history of the Reformation here, much as I would love to. But some of you probably are familiar with the basic outline of the story of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. And central to that Reformation was a radical rejection of this medieval understanding of penitence, in which things like personal asceticism and things like giving alms can contribute to your salvation and lead to a better relationship with God. For reformers like Luther, all human beings were utterly depraved. It's a great Lutheran phrase, absolute depravity. The absolute depravity of human beings. All had sinned and fell short of the glory of God, and therefore any attempt to save an individual soul through either the renunciation of physical possessions or the performance of good works was ludicrously inadequate. Human beings were saved, he argued, by God's mercy and God's mercy alone. There was absolutely nothing whatsoever that a human being could do to contribute to her salvation. Worst of all in Luther's eyes was the notion that salvation could be achieved or even contributed to by external physical works of the kind so prized in the medieval scheme. So he wrote in The Freedom of the Christian in 1520, quote, "It is evident that no external thing at all, whatever its name, has any part in producing Christian righteousness or freedom, nor does it produce unrighteousness or servitude. How can it benefit the soul if the body is in good health, free and active, eating and drinking and going where it pleases, when even the most ungodly slaves to complete wickedness may overflow in such things? On the other hand, how could poor health or captivity or hunger or thirst or any other external misfortune harm the soul, when even the godliest, purest, and freest consciences are afflicted with such things? Not one of these things touches, right, positively or negatively, not one of these things touches upon the freedom or servitude of the soul. Thus it does not help the soul if the body wears the sacred robe set apart for priests, enters sacred places, performs sacred duties, or prays, fasts, very important for monasticism, or prays, fasts, abstains from certain foods, or does absolutely any work connected with the body. Righteousness and freedom of the soul will require something completely different, since the things just mentioned could easily be done by some ungodly person, and since such efforts result only in producing hypocrites. Moreover, so that we may exclude everything, even contemplation, meditation, or whatever else can be done by the soul's efforts. So even things like prayer, meditation, contemplation, these are also excluded from the causes of Christian righteousness and freedom for Luther. All of this has no benefit. One thing and one thing alone is necessary for the Christian life, righteousness, and freedom, and that is the most holy word of God, the gospel of Christ. So says Martin Luther. This theology of necessity radically redefined the conception of both the beggar and the almsgiver. For the almsgiver, yes, Luther thought Christians certainly should still do good works, but they should be done out of a pure expression of love for God and for neighbor, not on account of their necessity for salvation. The do-gooder no longer had anything to gain from their charity, and in a sense this made their good works purer in motivation. But it also stripped, in an important sense, the moral power and authority from the poor. They were no longer needed to intercede with God, no longer missionaries to the rich with a special spiritual status, no longer needed as participants in relationships of mutual support. And so this shifts a relational understanding of almsgiving, in which both sides are getting something, to one that goes all one way, from the almsgiver to the recipient. Rather, the poor now are framed not as special holy people before God, but as a social problem to be solved. As Carter Lindbergh has argued, quote, since righteousness coram Deo, before God, in the presence of God, was thought to be by grace alone, it became difficult to rationalize the plight of the poor as a peculiar form of blessedness. And we can see that this has positive and negative effects. On the one hand, a medieval romanticization of the life of the poor is stripped away. A new Christian imperative to alleviate, in a very concrete physical sense, poverty is reinforced. On the other hand, there's this shift in the power balance. In 1521, Luther wrote his famous Beutelordnung, Order of the Common Purse. And in 1522, this order, or a different version of it, was adopted not only in his city of Wittenberg in the northeast of Germany, but also that same year in the southern cities of Nuremberg and Augsburg as well. The order pooled income from various closed medieval fraternities, churches, monasteries, and guilds, all of these different institutions that had previously existed to serve the poor, into a common community chest. And this chest was controlled by elected poor wardens. Now that's going to be an important term to think about. Who needs a warden? Right? Prisoners and maybe children. Right? So poor wardens are now elected. The mayor and the pastor of the community church. And together this committee would determine who would receive aid on the basis of genuine need and not emotional appeals for support. Begging and vagrancy, previously prized as uniquely Christian, or sort of a unique way to conform yourself to Christ, were strictly prohibited, since all those, it was thought, in genuine need would be sustained through this common purse. To this end, all the poor were to be numbered and evaluated by community leaders, kept on a central register, and monitored for morality. This money shouldn't be going to the immoral poor, to those who aren't working quite hard enough, or those who aren't properly Christian. And it certainly shouldn't go to people from outside the community. So you have to have a central register of all the poor in your individual village or section of the city. So that if someone from outside comes, they're not on the list, they're not going to get aid. Luther wrote in his address to the Christian nobility of the German nation that unrestricted begging is unchristian and injurious to the common while his reformist colleague Andreas Bodenstein von Karlstadt went further, arguing that, quote, beggars are running all about after bread, begging for bread on the streets, before the houses, sitting in the churches. Their desire and action is unchristian, fraudulent, and noxious, for they have no pretext for their begging in Holy Scripture. The vagrant beggar went from being the pinnacle of Christian piety and holiness to an unscriptural, dangerous drain on the community, suspected of dodging honest Christian work. Indeed, this critique was particularly applied to monasticism and to the friars. Right? The friars don't need to do anything special to achieve salvation. It's given freely by God. So they should quit begging and learn an honest trade and stop leeching off everybody else. This shift played a central role in Max Weber's story, though flawed analysis of the so-called Protestant work ethic. Maybe some people have heard of this idea, that this unique Protestant emphasis on the importance of work played a role in the development of capitalism. So Weber writes about this in The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism in 1905, and much more fully in Wirtschaft und Gesellschaft, Economy and Society, in 1921 too. Weber argued that the move from indiscriminate individual charity, which he described using the Latin word caritas, which he said characterized the medieval vision, which did not inquire after the worthiness of the recipient, because giving charity is good in itself, regardless of the worthiness of the recipient, right? Which, as Weber says, gave the shirt when the cloak was asked for, obviously again using Matthew's language there, to what he describes as a rationalized, bureaucratized poor relief as a form of Sozialpolitik, social policy, which measured policy, judged what relief was deserved, and used charity as a form of Sozialdisciplinierung, social disciplining, right? Forcing people into conformity. Right? If you want to receive aid, your pastor and the mayor have to judge you to be a moral, good person. So you had better conform with what they they think the way you should live your life should be. Faber argues that in the course of the Reformation, for this reason, charity moved, quote, from the postulate of brotherly love to the loveless realities of the economic domain. We'll come back to that in a minute. So, central to these Beutelordnungen is a distinction between the deserving and undeserving poor, a distinction that would have been unthinkable in the medieval framework, which emphasized not the material benefit to the impoverished person receiving aid, but to the spiritual benefit of the giver. Central also is the treatment of poverty as a problem to be rationally solved by good administration, embodied in the civic and religious leaders of the community. This was an approach to poor relief that could be more comprehensive and consistent, it was thought at least, in the ad hoc efforts of innumerable medieval confraternities, monasteries, and do-gooders, but also one which decisively shifted power into the hands of central authorities. Over time, as this concept spread throughout the Protestant territories of the Holy Roman Empire, these central authorities developed into a complex bureaucracy of Almosenpfleger, alms lords, who maintain, even that concept of an alms lord, I'm the lord of the alms, right? It gives you a sort of framework for how people are thinking about this. These people maintain lists of the impoverished in their communities, distinguish between the deserving and undeserving poor, set the poor to work, enforced prohibitions on vagrancy and begging, and expelled foreign paupers who were not on their centralized list from the community. And precisely the same pattern can be seen throughout the Protestant territories in Europe, not just in Germany. In 1525, Huldrych Zwingli, the reformer of Zurich in Switzerland, issued his Almosenordnung, alms order, which set up a centralized alms office, which required the registration and categorization of all of Zurich's poor and prohibited begging and vagrancy. Again, begging goes from being idealized to being outlawed. In 1528, the city of Bern founded its Musshafen, another centralized alms organization, explicitly citing Zwingli's 1525 order as the rationale for doing so. In 1530, Basel did the same. And a similar story can be told here in England. The Vagabonds Act of 1530 introduced far harsher measures to enforce the existing prohibition on vagabondage, replacing confinement in the stocks with public whipping as the penalty for vagabondage, essentially for homelessness. And crucially, and by the way, this act is in the process of being repealed at the moment. It's still on the statute books now as we speak. Parliament is in the process of repealing the Vagabond Act only now. Crucially, it also required anyone wishing to beg to obtain a license from the justices of the peace. And this made local magistrates in England responsible, as in the German and Swiss examples, for categorizing and supervising the poor in their area. The Poor Act of 1551 ordered each parish to create a parish chest along the same lines as the existing community chest in mainland Europe, from which the poor who were both local and licensed would be supported. In 1572, the Vagabonds Act was further strengthened, requiring justices of the peace to more carefully categorize the poor, noting those who were poor due to age, who due to infirmity, who due to moral failure, perceived lack of a desire to work, and assess the money required for their keep. It also imposed a compulsory poor rate on the inhabitants of each parish, from which the poor within that parish were to be supported. You can see the benefit. There's a dedicated tax to fund support of the poor. So on the one hand, there's arguably more consistent relief of the poor. On the other hand, power and agency is shifted away from the poor towards those tasked with overseeing them, these JPs. This all culminated in the Act for the Relief of the Poor of 1601, which required the annual appointment of overseers for the poor. Again, like poor wardens in Germany, overseers for the poor. Who needs overseers, right? The people who can't be trusted themselves. Separate from the JPs, responsible for both alleviating poverty and regulating the lives of the poor people in each parish. These overseers were required to provide work for the able-bodied poor, unpaid and indeed forced apprenticeships for poor children, and money and or food to those poor judged to be truly impotent, if they were aged or sick. Across the board, the 17th century saw the development of ever more sophisticated systems for managing the poor and poor relief, often in centralized facilities, known in German as Zuchthäuser, Arbeitshäuser, and in English as houses of correction or workhouses. And many people will have maybe read something from Dickens talking about the 19th century workhouse, have some image of that. In 1608, the city of Hamburg established its notorious Werk- und Zuchthaus, which stood until 1842. There, the poor, vagabonds, or those deemed sinful or committed to the house by their families were confined. Their most basic material needs were provided for, but they were also forced to labor for the city without pay, crushing flax to make linen, spinning, weaving, sewing, making shoes, and dyeing textiles. And they were subject to a strict system of discipline and punishment, under which they could be whipped, confined, or denied food on the basis of perceived rebellion or laziness. By the 18th century, 3% of the total population of Hamburg was confined in this one single workhouse, and there were many other workhouses across the city. And this pattern, which started notoriously in Hamburg, was repeated across Germany and England, Switzerland, and elsewhere. So England, following the 1601 Poor Act, Bridewell Prison here in London, originally designed for the housing of orphans and the correction of, quote, unruly women. So you think, what group of women we're talking about here if you're dealing with orphans, fatherless children, and quote unquote unruly women, became a model for houses of correction and workhouses, often known colloquially as Bridewells for that reason. Initially a way to punish the, quote, idle poor, as categorized by JPs and subsequently overseers, as the 17th century progressed, these houses of correction were increasingly turned into a means of reducing the tax burden posed by poor rates. Right, this tax to support the lives of the poor. So if the poor could be made to work, the profits of their unpaid labor could fund the system and essentially could fund tax cuts. This sort of led to a rolling system in the 17th and 18th century of a series of acts contributing to the development of the workhouse. In 1723, Parliament passed the Workhouse Test Act, obliging anyone seeking poor relief to do so in exchange for labor in a workhouse. The thought was, even if you're very aged and sick, there's probably something they can find for you to do in the workhouse. And the workhouse system was not abolished in England until 1930. The final workhouses were not closed until 1948. There are people in this city right now who were born and spent their early childhoods in workhouses. They were open until 1948. So that's where some aspects of the logic of this medieval to Reformation shift can lead us. Weber's neat contrast of medieval caritas with a standardized, rationalized, bureaucratic modern system of poor relief is, of course, too simple. At the heart of early modern efforts for poor relief, these common chests, was the impulse to care comprehensively for the poor and to ensure that they were not subject to the random whims and generosity or lack thereof of passerby. The medieval idealization of poverty has deeply problematic elements, as it erases the gap between those voluntarily choosing a form of poverty within the security of a monastic community and those involuntarily subject to its indiscriminate ravages, denied even any vestige of economic agency. We ought surely to join with the great 16th century English Protestant reformer Hugh Latimer's cry that it cannot be right, quote, that dead images not only ought to be covered with gold, but also ought to be clad with silk garments, whereas in the meantime we see Christ's faithful and lively images, bought with no less a price than with his most precious blood, alas, alas, to be an hungered and thirst a cold, and to lie in darkness, wrapped in all wretchedness, yea, to lie there until death take away their miseries. Yet we ought also ever to be aware that great dangers come when the rich, the educated, and the powerful set out on programs of eradication, even the eradication of poverty, without entering into relationship with those whose ills they seek to destroy. The medieval penitential framework may have unjustly idealized poverty, but it also gave to the poor a dignity and a spiritual power, role, and purpose, which later, to use Weber's words, rationalized, communalized, and bureaucratized poor relief schemes denied them. Once the poor ceased in the conceptual imaginary to have a special place in the eyes of God, once they ceased to have a spiritual power to offer in exchange for the material benefits offered by those supporting them, their agency was reduced and they became subjects to programs of relief far beyond their control. Therein lay the foundations of the workhouse, of the image of the feckless, work-shy vagrant, of the notion that the poor, far from being holy, are foolish or sinful and cannot be trusted to manage their own affairs. That like children, they need wardens to oversee their affairs and confirm by rational means that the money allocated to them is spent with maximum efficiency. The logic of efficiency over relationship in poor relief can be the logic of the workhouse, the logic that led devout Christians, sincerely devout Christians, to cage, quote-unquote, immoral inmates in the Hamburg Werk- und Zuchthaus at mealtimes, forcing them to starve as they looked through the bars as their more obedient peers ate. The dangers of this logic ought, I hope, to be evident to all, but Christians in particular are obliged to see always in the faces of the poor not only a problem to be solved, but the face of Christ himself. Thank you. So I realized I was supposed to plug Slido, and JD very kind of properly told me, plug Slido at the beginning of your talk, and I completely forgot to do that. So I have no idea if anyone has done anything on Slido, and I will look at that now. But feel free, if anyone has any questions, comments, thoughts, ideas. I only do dead people. I'm a historian, so I'm eager to hear if any of you feel like this has any relationship to people living today, or any thoughts or ideas you might have. Yeah, go ahead.
I've been learning a little bit about Catholic social theory recently, hearing a lot about community development as well. So I think learning from history and that there are these very interesting views of court and power speaks very much into the conversations that I'm hearing now. I don't have all the answers yet. I've got one more of these sessions on Catholic social theory to go. But yeah, it's interesting because it really makes us think about what we're doing today and how people will look back in the future at what we're doing. Have you reflected on that at all?
Well, I think that element of the importance of relationship in poor relief is something that I think is really central to particularly Christian efforts, or ought to be really central, particularly to Christian efforts at social work. That's central to Catholic social teaching. There was a text published by the Vatican Commission on Doctrine at the end of last year, all about the poor as missionaries to the rich. And I think that idea of agency is really important, because so often poor relief denies agency to its recipients. And I think one of the really great things about Christian poor relief can be that it has the potential to offer a different form of agency. Right? Like by definition, poor people have less money than rich people. That's kind of the whole thing. Right? So they're not ever really going to have more economic agency. And they're probably not going to have more political or this-worldly agency. We can try and mitigate that difference, but inevitably it's the case that the powerful have more powerful than the powerless. The rich have more money than the poor. But Christians have the opportunity to offer a different form of agency, which is spiritual agency and power, which I think is real, and can translate into the way these interactions take place. And that can be one way that particularly Christians have something additional to offer that maybe purely secular charitable efforts don't. And I think there is an important element to the history there as well. As we move from, in places like Europe and the United States at least, traditionally very Christian societies towards much more secular societies, one thing that we need to be attentive to is what are we potentially leaving behind? So I think, thank you for that comment. I think it's really helpful. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for your talk. And I think the thing that made me think about most was kind of the role of the church in society, which I guess is kind of common. But the other day I saw there was something going on social media about this woman. She kind of did like a bit of a thought experiment, and she called 10 mosques and asked if she could like sleep there at night. And she called 10 churches, and I think she did it both in the UK and America, and no church said yes. And I think obviously it's a small sample size, and there were people kind of questioning how and why she did what she did. But I think it did make me think about the church has throughout history and even till now always been such a central force in helping the poor, helping people in need. And I wanted to ask, you kind of touched on, I know it's a bit more nuanced than this, but kind of the Reformation idea on poor relief and also the kind of more monastic and medieval thoughts on it. And I wanted to ask you, kind of between the two thoughts, do you think that there's a way that both kind of thought schools can coexist in today's society for the church's role in society, and what do you think that could look like?
Thanks, that's a great question. Yeah, I saw that as well. I think probably a lot of people did, and it's very, very striking. I was reminded of, one of the things I mentioned earlier in the talk was Benedict of Nursia's rule, a Benedictine rule, which some of you may have encountered. One of the things in that rule is that every guest should be welcomed as Christ himself. And so ideally in a Benedictine community, if they're really following St. Benedict's rule, anybody that shows up the door is welcomed as Christ himself. And so in the Middle Ages, if you were traveling and you were lost, one of the best places you could go would be a monastery, because they have a kind of almost legal obligation, like in the statutes of the organization. They have to welcome you as if you were Christ and give you a place to stay and give you food. Now, the challenge comes with, okay, practically, if you're running a church, if you're running a Christian organization, you can't do everything for everyone all the time. And one of the, I think, real kind of challenges that the reformers put to the medieval monastic system is to say, okay, but there are also all kinds of people who you're not addressing with these kind of much more ad hoc, slightly random efforts at charity. They're very indiscriminate, and that has a great advantage to it. And I love that line that Weber uses to talk about this, that medieval charity was charity that gave the shirt when the cloak was asked for. I think that spirit of trying to give the shirt when the cloak is asked for and not inquiring always about the deserving, right? Because someone calls you up on the phone, do they really need a place to stay? Do they have another agenda? We naturally have all these kinds of questions. And those are good questions to have, but I think the balance is to think about these questions and not overdo it, to have that spirit of hospitality that says, you should welcome someone as Christ himself. And maybe they will be very non-Christ-like. But that's kind of their problem. I think we could use more of that medieval spirit of indiscriminate giving that doesn't always worry as much about, is this person really deserving, or is this the best way for me to run my organization at this moment? But they absolutely both have to be balanced. Yes, sir.
In the medieval times, did they have any conception or much conception of sort of impartial altruism or almsgiving outside of local communities? Because what you described was fairly localized.
Yeah.
I guess that's my question.
So I don't know about impartial, but there are definitely efforts at international and even intercontinental almsgiving in this period. So there are a lot of appeals for international efforts. I have to say most of the ones that immediately spring to mind are not super sympathetic to modern Christians. So the Crusades is the most obvious example. There's a massive Europe-wide fundraising appeal, and it contributes massively to the development of certain important financial structures, because you have to actually move all of this money from like Wales and Norway and Italy to Jerusalem, and you don't want to carry it all in coins. So people create financial instruments to enable the movement of these funds from across Europe, across different currencies, to fund things like the Knights in Jerusalem. The Crusades probably is not the best model for contemporary Christian almsgiving, but there is something of that element. Having said that, definitely the emphasis is on the local. There's much more of a sense, partly for practical reasons, right? Most people, the overwhelming majority of people in the Middle Ages would never have gone more than 10 miles from their home village. And so I think, for people, I live in Oxford, for people in Oxford, London would have been like sort of Japan is to us now, right? It's an incredibly distant place that's very, very far away, very culturally different. And so I think there are all kinds of practical barriers that exist there. But people are certainly aware of kind of people beyond local areas. I guess one of the other big differences, of course, is that Western Europe is maybe the poorest region in the world in the medieval period. And so that creates a very different dynamic between different regions than exists today, where Western Europe is relatively rich. And there's very good reasons to think that maybe you should send money from Western Europe to a poorer region of the world, whereas in the Middle Ages, Western Europe is much poorer than, say, Sub-Saharan Africa. So that also creates a different dynamic.
We have a couple of questions here on Slido.
Great.
So I think we could maybe take these next. It's all right with you.
Yes.
Yeah. So the first one is, how would the medieval framework of almsgiving deal with the question of limited resources? When the giver cannot help everyone, how do they prioritize?
So the emphasis is very much on God's agency in the medieval framework. So there is very limited evidence for kind of complex systems of evaluation. And it was kind of thought to be unchristian to evaluate people too stringently. So kind of first come, first serve. And that's a kind of problematic model in a lot of ways. But it also has certain advantages I think shouldn't be overlooked. One very popular means of almsgiving, not only for kind of Christian institutions like monasteries, but also just for kind of rich people in medieval Europe, is very literally to open the windows of their big house and literally throw money out. I mean, literally throw heaps of coins out into the street. And what's kind of interesting about that is that it's probably like the least efficient, or certainly least targeted, let's say. It's very efficient, right? You have no admin, no overhead costs. But it's the least targeted way that you can possibly give money. But the idea was that it's up to God who will get this money, how they will receive it, and it's a way of totally giving up power or agency over the distribution on the part of the donor. Because if the donor is targeting certain people and saying, okay, I've got this metric, I want people who are like this, right? The donor is deciding who gets the money. And I think we don't have to go as far as saying, like, the best way to give money is literally to open the window of your flat and just like throw 10-pound notes out, as a lot of people in the Middle Ages did. But maybe just to be aware that that is a model that existed, and to think about why that was so compelling for people for centuries, when today that seems completely crazy. Is there another?
Second idea for the question from Slido is, which countries, if any, do you think model good systems for looking after the poor?
So I can't answer in regard to today, because as I said, I only do dead people. I'm strictly a historian. I had a student last year who proposed working on Merciana Gagne, who's a very elderly theologian. I think she's in her 90s, but she's still alive, so I can't do her. In a couple of years, we can check back. But in the early modern period, I think, I mean, it's tricky, but I think smaller polities on the whole had less centralized systems of poor relief. So I'm thinking about the Low Countries, became the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Even after it embraces many of these sort of Protestant ideas, doesn't adopt the same level of centralization compared with other Calvinist countries like Switzerland. Also a lot of the fragmented territories in the north of Italy, so the sort of city-states there. And I wonder if there's something there about the localization of the model, right? That there's less distance between the central authorities and the individual poor people. But I really haven't thought about that question very much, so I don't have a very good answer. But that's a really interesting kind of topic to think about.
Those were the two most upvoted questions on Slido, so I think we can continue with that.
Sure.
Yeah.
I want to quickly piggyback of the question you just answered, even though you said no one thought about it. Were any of those medieval frameworks or models targeted at actually bringing people out of poverty, rather than just maybe doling out palliatives to help the poor, like to tie them over for certain periods? Was any actually aimed at getting people out of poverty?
So I would say two things. One, yes. So a concrete example that I can think of off the top of my head would be in the city of Augsburg. Jakob Fugger, who was probably the richest man in 16th century Germany. You can kind of have a debate about whether it was him or the emperor, and it depends how you categorize like public versus private goods that the emperor owned. But he was the richest private citizen, created a mass public housing complex called the Fuggerhai, which still exists there, so people still live there. And essentially it was sort of social housing. And so that was an effort at essentially giving people good quality free housing, good quality jobs, education for their children, and provision of basic health standards, but at the standards of the time. And so that, you could say, is a framework that would help someone in a really substantive long-term way get out of poverty if they have sustainably good housing and access to a sustainably good job. So that would be one example. I mean, a lot of monasteries and local communities gave out aid every day. And you know, that you can find examples of monasteries that have given aid every day for over 1,000 years still today. So that's sort of fairly consistent. And one of the things that will do in the local community is to say that people there know that there is daily free food coming from this monastery. So that's sustainable in a way that sort of one-off donations might not be. However, having said all of that, one of the things that I want to emphasize is that for medieval Christians, poverty is a holy state. The poor have a special place before God, and in that sense, there's a certain theological framing in which poverty is actively good. And this has positive aspects, as I said, because of the dignity it gives to the poor, but it also has very negative aspects because it can potentially undermine efforts at sort of lifting people out of poverty, because you're saying actually it's good they're in poverty. So there are kind of trade-offs there.
There's a couple of other questions rising on Slido. So,
sure.
As history repeats itself, do you think we could cycle back into these thought patterns in the future?
I think I think so. I think there is an extent to which people are moving away from the kind of, so I think the rationalization of poor relief goes together with the rise of rationalization of statecraft generally. This is always thought of as sort of connected to a movement called cameralism. This idea that everything should be done really rationally, basically, and that we can continually get better and better by more application of science and reason to all of these different aspects of human life. And that was a sort of growing phenomenon from the 17th century through most of the 20th century. And I think what we've seen since, the sort of start of the 21st century maybe, is starting to be people sort of questioning that narrative of inherent progress, questioning whether all of those changes that happened in the past few centuries really are progress, increasing observation that a lot of the progress in places like Western Europe and the United States was built on the back of colonialism, that there were all sorts of medieval ways of life that were erased through these processes. And so that idea that we can place total faith in human reason, I think among religious and secular people alike is being questioned much more now than it was really any time in the past few centuries. So I think that might kind of feed into an interest in not going back to, because I think overall we definitely have made progress since the Middle Ages, but rereading and learning from some of these medieval ideas and kind of priorities.
One more from Slido.
Sure.
Should more Christians choose to be poor?
So this is a question for a theologian, and I am strictly a historian. I do dead Christians, not living Christians. But I think there is something valuable about having members of the community who are embracing a radically different kind of life than other members of the community or than the mainstream. If you read the Acts of the Apostles, it certainly seems like the Christians there are embracing a radically different form of economic life than the mainstream members of the community. And I don't think that necessarily means everyone has to be a monk or everyone has to be a hermit living in the desert. But I do think the perspective of those people is really valuable. I don't think it's coincidental that so many of the greatest figures in the history of Christianity have been people who have lived very economically alternative lifestyles. And so I think it is important for that to be one of the elements that makes up the church. So yeah, maybe arguably more Christians should choose to be poor. Yes, sir, you've had your hand up a few times.
I wanted to ask, you mentioned kind of the whole idea of Reformed Luther's kind of thinking around that kind of faith alone, and kind of what that does to people's motivation to give in. I had a conversation with somebody yesterday, one of the guys who runs the think tank about institutes. He was talking about, I asked him, does he ever kind of work and feel like he doesn't want to? And he said, yeah, sometimes he does, but it's about duty rather than necessarily wanting to. And I think that's quite a common thing today where people sometimes, when it comes to giving, they want to feel like they're doing the right thing or like want to make sure their motivations are right, their heart posture is correct, etc. And in terms of learning from like the whole medieval idea around giving, do you think that we in the modern day need to sometimes find a better balance or kind of just move more towards duty rather than right motivation, faith?
Yeah, I think the concept of duty is really, really central, because if motivation is rooted in either just sort of what you want to do, or even in more subjective feelings around your relationship to God framed in a purely, I don't want to say positive, because duty is positive, but you know what I mean, in a purely optimistic way, let's say. That's all about you feel good because God has filled you with it, right? That's tremendous, and that's really important in the Christian life. But I think duty is also really important. God gives commandments as well as promises, and I think that concept of duty is absolutely fundamental in the way that medieval people thought about the world, and most pre-modern people. And I think one of the challenges that we have in modern society is that people tend to be afraid to talk about duty in that positive way. But if you think about it from a Christian perspective, obviously we're living after the fall. Our wills are corrupted by sin, they're fallible. And so whenever you root something in your own will, your own desire, what you feel like doing, you know that's inevitably going to be fallible and it's going to make mistakes. And one of the correctives against that is duty, and saying, I don't feel like doing this, but God told me I have to do it, so maybe I can moan about it. There's loads of great biblical examples of people sort of grumpily saying, God bless you, grumpily saying, I really don't want to go here, but God has commanded me to go. You can have it, but still going in conformity with that duty. I think that's really, really important. And that's a central concept for Luther as well.
All right, we are at the end. Our time is up.
Okay.
But thank you so much, and thank you everyone for your great questions as well. Yeah.
Thank you all so much.